In the small, unassuming town of Gideon's Hollow, nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, nothing much ever happened. The community was tightly knit, bound by generations of tradition and faith. At the heart of it all was St. Mark's Church, a towering, ancient structure that stood as a beacon of hope and morality. Its leader, Father Daniel Moreau, was a man revered by all, a kind, compassionate soul who had dedicated his life to guiding the flock. But behind the closed doors of the rectory, Father Daniel harbored a dark secret, a secret that, if revealed, would shatter the illusion of sanctity that the town clung to so desperately. Rose Whitaker was just 16, a delicate beauty with golden hair and a voice that lit up the church choir every Sunday morning. She was the daughter of Margaret Whitaker, a single mother who often sought solace in the church after the tragic death of her husband. Rose, too, found comfort there, particularly in the attention of Father Daniel. At first it seemed innocent enough, a guiding hand, a fatherly figure offering wisdom and comfort to a young girl navigating the trials of adolescence. But as the months passed, their bond deepened into something far more sinister. Hey, quick pause. If you're enjoying this so far, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel and motivates me to keep bringing you more amazing content. Now let's continue with the content. Rose was drawn to Father Daniel's charisma, his authority, and the way he made her feel seen in a town where she often felt invisible. Father Daniel, in turn, found himself captivated by her innocence, her beauty, a forbidden temptation that grew more irresistible with each passing day. Their meetings, once public and harmless, soon shifted to the shadows. In the quiet of the rectory, away from the watchful eyes of Gideon's Hollow, whispers of Scripture turned into soft confessions of affection. Their connection spiraled into a dangerous liaison, one that neither of them could control nor admit to anyone. Gideon's Hollow had its secrets, as all small towns do. Gossip spread like wildfire, and nothing stayed hidden for long. But no one suspected the revered Father Daniel of wrongdoing. He was the town's moral compass, the man who had baptized their children, buried their dead, and counseled their troubled souls. Rose, however, began to change. Her once radiant smile faded, replaced by a quiet, contemplative sadness. Her friends noticed. Her mother noticed. But when asked, Rose would only say she was tired or that school was overwhelming. Then there were the gifts, small tokens of affection that Father Daniel would leave for her. A delicate bracelet, a book of poetry, and once a letter. Rose kept them hidden in a wooden box beneath her bed, a shrine to their forbidden love. She knew it was wrong, yet she was caught in a web of emotions far beyond her years. As the months wore on, Father Daniel grew paranoid. He feared discovery, the shame, the fall from grace that would surely follow. The once thrilling secrecy of their affair now filled him with dread. Rose, too, began to feel the weight of their actions. She wanted more, a future, a life beyond Gideon's Hollow. But for Daniel, such a future was impossible. One evening, Rose confided in him her desire to leave the town, to escape the suffocating confines of their secret. She suggested they run away together, start anew in a place where no one knew them. But Daniel knew better. There was no escape from the vows he had taken, the collar he wore, and the eyes of God he believed were always watching. That night, their conversation turned heated. In the dim light of the rectory, voices were raised, emotions frayed. Rose, frustrated and heartbroken, threatened to reveal their affair, to her mother, to the town, to anyone who would listen. Daniel, in a moment of panic and desperation, tried to calm her, to reason with her, but Rose was resolute. She had sacrificed too much and could no longer live in the shadows. The next morning, Rose's lifeless body was found at the edge of Whispering Pines Forest, just outside town. Her golden hair was matted with blood, her delicate hands cold and still. The town was shaken to its core. A young girl, so full of life, taken in such a violent, senseless way. The investigation began immediately. Sheriff Ethan Hawthorne, a man who had known Rose since she was a child, vowed to find her killer. The town mourned, and St. Mark's Church became a place of grieving. Father Daniel led the congregation in prayer, his voice steady, his eyes betraying nothing. But inside, he was crumbling. Each day he stood before the town, offering words of comfort, knowing that he was the very source of their sorrow. He watched as Margaret Whitaker, devastated by the loss of her only child, clung to her faith, oblivious to the true monster who stood before her. The investigation into Rose's death was relentless. Witnesses were questioned, alibis checked, and secrets unearthed. It wasn't long before the sheriff's attention turned to the church. Rumors began to surface, whispers of a relationship between Father Daniel and Rose. Sheriff Hawthorne, though hesitant to believe such accusations, could not ignore the growing evidence. He questioned Father Daniel, who denied everything, his voice calm, his demeanor composed. But beneath the surface he was unraveling. One evening the sheriff discovered the box of gifts hidden beneath Rose's bed. The letter, written in Father Daniel's distinctive handwriting, was the final piece of the puzzle. Father Daniel was arrested, charged with the murder of Rose Whitaker. The town was thrown into chaos. Some refused to believe it, defending the man who had been their spiritual leader for so long. Others, however, began to see the cracks in the facade, the truth hidden behind the collar. In court, Daniel sat stoically as the evidence was presented. The gifts, the letter, the testimonies of those who had seen them together. Margaret Whitaker, frail and broken, watched from the front row, her eyes filled with tears and disbelief. When the verdict was read, guilty of murder in the first degree, the town of Gideon's Hollow fell silent. Father Daniel Moreau, the man they had trusted, was led away in handcuffs, his fall from grace complete. Years passed, but the memory of Rose Whitaker lingered in Gideon's Hollow. Her grave, adorned with fresh flowers, became a place of quiet and peace. St. Mark's Church stood empty for a time, a haunting reminder of the sins that had unfolded within its walls. And Father Daniel? He spent the rest of his days in a cold, gray prison cell, haunted by the ghost of the girl he had loved and destroyed. His name, once spoken with reverence, became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most trusted among us can fall, and that some sins can never be forgiven. The trial might have ended, but the scars left on Gideon's Hollow were fresh, raw, and unyielding. Whispers of Father Daniel's guilt divided the town into two factions. On one side were those who clung to their unwavering faith in the man who had baptized their children and buried their dead. On the other were those who believed in the evidence, proof that the man behind the pulpit was not a shepherd, but a wolf in disguise. Sheriff Ethan Hawthorne, the man responsible for putting Daniel behind bars, found himself in the crosshairs of public scrutiny. The town demanded answers. Some accused him of acting too quickly, too harshly. Others whispered that he'd been pressured by the state to make an arrest. Despite the guilty verdict, a sense of uncertainty lingered. In the quiet hours of the night, Ethan would revisit the evidence. He had built the case meticulously, interviewed witnesses, pieced together timelines, followed every thread. Yet there was something he couldn't shake, a nagging feeling, an inconsistency buried deep in the folds of the investigation. One night, alone in the dim light of his office, he spread the case files across his desk. He reread witness statements, scrutinized photographs, and sifted through the autopsy report. Something didn't add up. The position of Rose's body, the pattern of the bloodstains, it hinted at something off. He needed answers. He needed closure. And deep down, Ethan feared the truth might be far more sinister than anyone had imagined. Margaret Whittaker had become a shadow of her former self. Her once lively eyes were now hollow, drained of the light that Rose had brought into her life. She spent her days at her daughter's grave, whispering prayers into the wind, asking questions that had no answers. One afternoon, while tending to the flowers on Rose's grave, Margaret noticed something peculiar. A man, tall, gaunt, unfamiliar, stood at a distance, watching her. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but there was something unsettling about him. "Who are you?" Margaret called out, her voice trembling. The man did not answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the thick of Whispering Pines forest. Margaret's heart raced. She glanced down at Rose's grave and noticed something new. A small, intricately carved wooden cross placed atop the headstone. She hadn't placed it there. That night, sleep eluded her. She kept thinking about the man, the cross, and a deep, gnawing fear began to take hold. Who was he? And why did she feel like Rose's story wasn't over? The following morning, Margaret found an envelope slipped beneath her front door. Inside was a single piece of paper with a cryptic message: "The truth lies deeper than you know. Seek, and you shall find." Margaret's hands shook as she read the note. Who had written it? Was it the strange man from the cemetery? Desperate for answers, she turned to the only person she could trust, Sheriff Ethan Hawthorne. Ethan listened carefully as Margaret recounted the encounter and the note, his brow furrowed with concern. "Did you recognize him?" he asked. "No," Margaret replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But I think he knows something about Rose." Ethan agreed to investigate. Together, they revisited the cemetery, searching for clues. At the base of Rose's grave, Ethan noticed something Margaret had overlooked, a small, inconspicuous marking carved into the wooden cross. It was a symbol, a serpent coiled around a staff. The symbol was familiar, but not from Gideon's Hollow. It was ancient, tied to forgotten myths and obscure religious orders. Ethan's mind raced. Who in this quiet town would know of such things, and what did it have to do with Rose's death? Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan delved into the town's history. He combed through old church records, historical archives, and forgotten journals. What he discovered sent a chill down his spine. Gideon's Hollow was not as innocent as it seemed. Decades ago, a secret society had operated within the town, a cult that worshipped forbidden deities and practiced dark rituals. They believed in the sacrifice of purity to appease their gods and bring prosperity to the town. The leader of this society? None other than Father Daniel Moreau's predecessor, Father Jonathan Hale. He had vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a legacy of fear and silence. Ethan wondered, had Daniel inherited more than just the church? Had he uncovered the cult's secrets and, in a moment of weakness, become ensnared in its dark web? Margaret, too, began to piece things together. She remembered stories her grandmother used to tell, warnings about the Whispering Pines, where shadows moved and voices called in the night. It wasn't just folklore, it was a warning. As Ethan and Margaret connected the dots, they realized the man from the cemetery was no stranger. He was a descendant of one of the cult's original members, a guardian of the dark secret that had claimed Rose's life. One stormy night, Margaret received another message. This time it was a photograph of Rose, alive and well, standing beside Father Daniel in the rectory. But something was off. The photo was dated 3 days after her death. Margaret's heart stopped. She rushed to Ethan, who could barely believe what he saw. "It's impossible," he muttered. Unless someone had faked her death." Margaret and Ethan retraced their steps, questioning everything they knew. Could Rose still be alive? Was her body in the forest a decoy? And if so, where was she now? Their search led them deep into the Whispering Pines, to an abandoned cabin once used by the cult. Inside, they found remnants of rituals, symbols painted in blood, and a journal belonging to Father Jonathan Hale. In the final entry, Hale confessed to attempting a resurrection ritual, one that required a false death and a hidden offering. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the words. She will rise, but at what cost? The town gathered once more at St. Mark's Church, this time not for prayer, but for truth. Ethan and Margaret stood before the congregation, revealing everything: the cult, the rituals, and the possibility that Rose might still be alive. As they spoke, a figure emerged from the shadows of the church, a girl with golden hair and hollow eyes. It was Rose, alive, but changed. Her voice was soft and distant, as if speaking from another world. "I never left," she whispered. "I was waiting." Father Daniel's arrest had been a cover. The cult had orchestrated everything, using Rose as their final offering to resurrect their fallen leader. But something had gone wrong. Rose had returned, but with the soul of someone or something else. The church fell silent as Rose approached the altar. She turned to face the congregation, her eyes dark and empty. "It's not over," she said, her voice echoing with a chilling finality. "He is coming." And with those words the lights flickered, and the town of Gideon's Hollow plunged into darkness. The darkness that engulfed Gideon's Hollow wasn't just the absence of light. It was a suffocating, palpable force that seemed to drain the very life from the town. Panic spread like wildfire. Families locked their doors, whispered prayers, and waited for dawn. But the sun never rose. Instead, an unnatural twilight hung over the town, casting long, eerie shadows across the streets. Inside St. Mark's Church, Sheriff Ethan Hawthorne and Margaret Whitaker stood frozen, their eyes locked on Rose, the girl who had returned, yet wasn't entirely herself. Her golden hair framed a face that looked familiar but held none of the warmth it once did. Her eyes, once vibrant and full of life, were now cold, distant, and filled with an ancient knowledge. "Rose," Margaret whispered, stepping forward, her heart aching with equal parts hope and dread. "Is it really you?" Rose tilted her head, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "I am what remains," she replied cryptically. "But I am not alone." The congregation, gathered in fear and confusion, murmured among themselves. Ethan stepped forward, his hand instinctively resting on the holster of his gun. "What do you mean, Rose? Who else is here?" Rose's gaze shifted to the altar, the very place where Father Daniel had led countless sermons, where generations had knelt in prayer. "The one they sought to awaken," she said softly, "the one they worshipped in secret." Ethan's mind raced. Father Jonathan Hale, the cult's leader, presumed dead, but now something more. The journal had warned of a resurrection, a ritual that required a vessel, and Rose had been that vessel. As Rose spoke, the air inside the church grew heavy. The wooden beams creaked, and the stained glass windows trembled as if the building itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the doors of the church burst open, and a cold wind swept through the nave. Standing in the doorway was the man from the cemetery, the gaunt, silent figure who had watched Margaret at Rose's grave. He stepped inside, his presence commanding and terrifying. His eyes were sharp and piercing, filled with an unnatural light. "Jonathan Hale," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "You're supposed to be dead." Hale smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. "Death is merely a doorway, Sheriff," he said, "and I have returned to complete what was left unfinished." Margaret's heart sank. The stories, the warnings, the symbols, it had all led to this moment. "Why, Rose?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Why, my daughter?" "Hmm?" Hale's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "She was chosen," he replied. "Her purity, her innocence. She was the perfect vessel to bridge the gap between this world and the next. Through her, I have returned." Ethan knew they had little time. Hale's presence was a threat not just to them but to the entire town. He turned to the congregation. "We can't let him take her," he said firmly. "We've already lost too much. This ends here." The townspeople, once divided by fear and suspicion, found unity in Ethan's words. Together, they formed a plan. They would confront the evil that had haunted their town for decades and put an end to it once and for all. Margaret, clutching the wooden cross she had found on Rose's grave, approached her daughter. "Rose, if there's any part of you left, if you can hear me, fight him. Come back to us." For a moment, the coldness in Rose's eyes flickered. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she whispered, "I'm trying, Mama. But he's so strong." Ethan and the townspeople surrounded Hale, their voices rising in a collective prayer, not one of submission, but of defiance. The walls of St. Mark's Church shook as the power of their faith clashed with the dark force that Hale had unleashed. Hale's smile faded as the air grew charged with energy. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion," he warned. "This town was built on sacrifice, and it will end in sacrifice." Ethan stepped forward, holding the journal of Father Hale in one hand and a revolver in the other. "You're wrong," he said. "Gideon's Hollow wasn't built on sacrifice. It was built on community, on faith, and on love." With a sudden burst of courage, Margaret raised the wooden cross and pressed it against Rose's chest. "Come back to me, Rose," she cried. "You are stronger than him. You are my daughter," Rose screamed, a sound that echoed with both pain and defiance. The church was filled with a blinding light as the ancient forces collided. Hale staggered backward, his form flickering like a shadow caught in the light of dawn. "No!" Hale roared, his voice filled with fury and desperation. "This is my domain." But it was too late. The bond between Rose and Hale was breaking. The power he had stolen was slipping from his grasp. With one final surge of light, Hale's form disintegrated into nothingness, leaving behind only a faint whisper that faded into the ether. When the light faded, the town of Gideon's Hollow stood in stunned silence. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by the soft glow of dawn breaking over the Rocky Mountains. The church, once a place of secrets and sorrow, now stood as a beacon of hope and redemption. Rose collapsed into Margaret's arms, her body weak but her spirit free. "Mama," Margaret held her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Yeah, you're safe now. My love, you're safe." Ethan, exhausted but relieved, looked out at the congregation. "It's over," he said. "The darkness is gone. The townspeople, once divided, now stood united in the light of a new day. They had faced their darkest fears and emerged stronger, bound by a shared resilience and the knowledge that even the deepest shadows can be overcome by the light of truth and love. And as the sun rose over Gideon's Hollow, the town began to heal, its people forever changed by the events that had unfolded, but determined to rebuild. A community reborn from the ashes of its past, ready to face whatever the future might hold.